Russia could be in danger, and it's because Ukraine's garage technology is making a big mess in the country. That's the latest prediction from geopolitical expert and strategist Peter Zyyhan. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has been a major focus of global news for the past few years. While it might seem like a distant problem to some, the reality is that this conflict affects many aspects of our world, from the economy to politics and even our daily lives. Why exactly is Russia interested in Ukraine? Russia views Ukraine as a key part of its influence. Historically, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, led by Russia. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Ukraine became independent. However, Russia sees Ukraine as a vital buffer against the West, especially NATO, which includes the US and many European countries. As NATO expanded eastward, closer to Russia's borders, Russia became anxious. They worry that if Ukraine joins NATO, it will weaken their security and influence, so they are determined to keep Ukraine within their sphere and prevent it from aligning too closely with the West. In a recent interview, Peter Zyyhan points out that Ukraine uses new technologies, like drones, to challenge Russia's power. This situation shows how the global economic shifts are impacting both countries, with Russia facing difficulties and Ukraine trying to find new ways to handle the situation. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video, where we will discuss Peter's insight into how Russia can maneuver this challenge. Also guys, only a small percentage of my viewers are subscribed. If you enjoy economics, geopolitics, and history, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind. Now, let's jump in with this interview with Peter Zyyhan.
I think you're right. It's ironic that it took Boebert in the United States and Donald Trump to force the Europeans into this conclusion. I think we were going to get there anyway. I think eventually it would have been obvious to everyone that even if the United States was completely committed every single day, that Ukraine still needed a lot of help, and that help has to come from Europe. So getting the leaders of the European institutions, which until recently were all about global cooperation, globalization, market access, and absolutely nothing military, singing a very different tune and talking about a German-style war economy, like Nazi German-style war economy, that's a breathtaking change. I can't say as an American I'm entirely comfortable with it, but I think it's a very logical extension of where we find ourselves now. And if Ukraine is going to survive, it is necessary. I don't doubt that when properly committed, the Europeans have the ability to do this. They do. It will lead into a lot of other interesting directions, though. Let's start with the tactical and then look at the strategic. The problem with taking out Ukrainian seaborne drones is angle. So if you've got a larger ship, whether it's a landing ship or a missile cruiser, you are designed to deal with things over the horizon, or you're designed to make a beach landing, do roll on, roll off. You don't expect to be swarmed by small things operating nearly at the waterline. And so angling something down in order to attack an incoming small vessel, especially at night, is nearly impossible with the weapons that your ship was built with. So putting on high caliber machine guns that can do that depressed angle is really your only option. But it means, for example, having ammo just stacked up on the deck, which has other problems. So it's a necessary change, but it's one that indicates that the Russian position in the western half of the Black Sea is already gone. And any ship that would be considered a pre-war surface combatant that the Americans might have had a little respect for, those are basically having to be shifted up over to Novorossiysk and parts even further east to stay out of range of these things. But it's also part of a broader strategic issue here. There's a four-part strategy at the moment for what the Ukrainians are doing with the drones and using these modified jet skis to go after Russian naval vessels. That's only part one. Part two is to compensate for the lack of American support at the moment, and that's to develop these 1 and 2 pound bombs that are carrying something that's the size of a grenade in order to replace artillery. And so when the Russians do their human wave tactics, you just send in several dozen, if not several hundred, of these small drones that are anti-personnel in nature. But the more strategic issues are things like the Scythe, which is basically a garage project. People basically taking aluminum and plywood, slapping a warhead on it, and then sending it off. And the Beavers, which have, I think it's about a 600-kilometer range, and using those to target energy infrastructure within 600 kilometers of the Ukrainian borders, they've done that against 15 facilities in just the last month and did significant damage to a number of them. But where things get a little sexy, and technically against American recommendations, is they're very clearly using those Phoenix Ghost shoulder-launched drones that were designed originally for anti-tank operations, and they're giving them to special forces and sending them 1,500 kilometers into Russia to then launch attacks at distillation towers on refineries well out of range of anything they can launch from Ukraine. The damage that has been done so far is significant, and the Ukrainians are very clearly ramping up those sort of operations. And you're talking about damage to an economic sector, energy exports, refined energy exports, that earn more for the Russians as a percentage of their overall budget than corporate taxes generate for Western countries. So the Ukrainians have found a very low-cost way of doing far more damage to the Russian economy than anything that has happened with the sanctions so far.
Ukraine has increasingly relied on drones for both tactical and strategic purposes. Initially used for surveillance, these unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, have evolved into potent warfare tools. Using drones has allowed Ukraine to punch above its weight, particularly in areas where traditional military assets might fall short. Russian naval forces, in particular, have faced unexpected challenges due to Ukrainian drones. Traditional naval vessels, such as landing ships and missile cruisers, are designed to engage threats over the horizon or make beach landings. They cannot handle small, agile drones operating close to the waterline. The angle and positioning required to intercept these drones, especially at night, make them difficult targets for standard naval weapons. To address this, Russian ships have had to adapt by installing high-caliber machine guns to target these low-flying drones. However, this adaptation has drawbacks, such as storing ammunition on deck, which presents risks. The Ukrainian drone campaign has had a substantial impact on the Russian economy. Ukraine has inflicted more cost-effective and impactful damage by targeting energy infrastructure than traditional sanctions. This economic pressure exacerbates the difficulties faced by the Russian government, which relies heavily on oil and gas exports. Moreover, Ukraine's drone tactics are forcing Russia to reassess its military strategies and defenses. The need for new countermeasures and adaptations represents a significant challenge for Russian forces, stretching their resources and complicating their operational plans. Let's get back to Peter Zyyhan as he explains this further.
The Phoenix Ghosts that come from the United States, those are the shoulder-launched ones. Those are great for what they're using them for now. It's not that they were bad against armor. They were basically an RPG at range. But they're discovering that there's a lot of sensitive spots that you can use with those. And so they've largely been removed from the battlefield and now being used for economic sabotage. The Beaver is 100% a Ukrainian special that they designed from the ground up, and it's only in its second generation. So I can only imagine what they're going to do for range and payload and accuracy moving forward. The Scythe is literally 1,000 Ukrainian dudes making these things in their garages. And if that gets any sort of regularization on a normal supply chain, you're talking about a much heavier warhead being able to be delivered at more than 400 kilometers range. That may very well be the way they break those internal logistical systems in Russia, most notably in Belgorod and Rostov-on-Don. Everyone in Russia is pretty inured to the government statements on things like that at this point. I mean, I'm amused at the one precinct in Russia where Putin did not get a commanding majority in the votes, they ordered a recount. It was just silly. That said, conscription is absolutely coming. It's just going to be stealth for now. Until such time as Putin feels that the propaganda has really dug in enough and had its impact, they're just going to do it on the sly. And they've shown for the last year and a half that they can conscript in excess of 30, 40,000 men a month and not call it conscription. And the population puts up with it. It would still be a month probably before we got the vote. And we've had something change here. Speaker Johnson has had a bit of a heart-to-heart meeting with the hardliners who are opposing any sort of aid. And he has put a series of things on the voting docket that even they realize have to happen, mostly related to budget issues. And so we finally do have a budget deal in the United States to continue funding the government, which is something that we're, I think, on our fourth one in the last 16 months. Anyway, it's finally happening. And in the same press conference that he announced that this was now going to be available for a vote, he talked about the tyranny of Russia and what it means to fight oppression and terrorism, and how Ukraine is one of the great lights standing against the darkness. And of course, the United States is going to step in and help. And you could tell that the people who have been stopping Ukrainian aid to this point choking on their bile, but none of them said anything. So if Johnson is true to his word, we will see, we should have a vote on the House floor within the next 2 weeks. And at that point, the Senate is expected to approve it relatively quickly, and Biden will sign into law almost a heartbeat later. But even on that, for American Congress accelerated time frame, that wouldn't suggest meaningful aid gets to Ukraine in April. So that's kind of the quasi-good, quasi-bad news. The better news is that Congress has no problem passing funding to get the U.S. defense complex running on a faster speed. So at least looking forward 6 to 12 months, the United States will have more of the production that is necessary, not just for itself and to restock the allies who have supplied the Ukraine while the United States has sat out, but probably even have some spare stuff to send Ukraine in addition to what was already planned. Well, from an American point of view, as opposed to a Western point of view, I would triple investment in strategic defense initiatives and anti-missile defense system. Push one way or another. This war is either going to go into NATO countries or it's going to go into Russia proper, and a nuke is going to fly. And the best defense that we can possibly have needs to be erected before that happens. So that's kind of midterm. Shorter term, dealing with the war itself, the Russians are not going to back down at this point, even if everyone immediately stops using Russian crude. But the goal has to be at this point to make sure that the Russians have problems rearming using third countries, whether it's Iran or China or North Korea. And the best way to do that is to completely destroy the income. So we need to move into a position where we're talking about a naval blockade that simply keeps Russian oil and natural gas off the market completely, and that shuts it in at the point of production in Siberia so it can not come back in anything less than a decade time frame. That is a step that no one in Europe has been willing to consider because there were a number of countries in Central Europe that were still dependent upon it. But as we get into the second half of this year, the only country in Europe that is still dependent on Russian energy is Hungary. So I would expect with this shift in rhetoric at the very top of not just Russian governments, but the EU Secretariat itself, that we're going to have a significant change on enforcement of sanctions and the nature of the sanctions in the second half of the year.
So why should we care about this conflict? The Russia-Ukraine conflict extends beyond regional borders, influencing global economics, energy markets, and international relations. The fighting has disrupted global trade, causing higher food prices and energy shortages while straining relationships between Russia and Western countries. This has led to a tense Cold War-like atmosphere, with increased military spending and fears of a wider conflict. On a humanitarian level, the conflict has displaced millions, causing severe shortages of necessities and leading to significant loss of life. The international community faces the challenge of supporting these affected populations while working towards a peaceful resolution. Efforts by Western nations to support Ukraine and pressure Russia have had mixed results, complicating the path to peace. Ongoing diplomatic efforts and humanitarian aid are crucial in addressing the crisis and preventing further escalation. Understanding the conflict's global impact highlights why it matters to everyone and underscores the need for continued efforts to achieve a resolution and provide relief to those affected. What do you think of these developments? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more updates and analysis as we track this critical story.